So this is an unusual starting point for a Groudle video. Good evening, Jonathan.
It is. Good evening, Alex. We are somewhere totally different today. We're at Derby Castle, which for the Manxies you'll know is at the northern end of Douglas Promenade. And tonight we're going to go for a ride on a tram.
Now, why are we going for a ride on a tram?
So the railway at Groudle owes its existence to the development of the Manx Electric Railway. And the electric railway itself has a very kind of interesting and convoluted history. Right the way from the middle of the 19th century, there were various schemes to put a railway up the eastern coast of the island towards Laxey and Ramsey. And the challenge that all of the engineers of the day had was that this route doesn't lend itself to a traditional steam railway. There are lots of tight curves, lots of little valleys that come in and inlets, and lots of steep gradients. So a conventional steam line was explored, and there were a number of different schemes for that, but they were all abandoned for the same reason, that the line was going to be too steep and too twisty. But not to be put off by that idea, the Victorian entrepreneurs formed the Douglas and Laxey Coast Electric Tramway and realised that by harnessing the new and modern power of electricity, they could use that to develop a tramway and build it out from Douglas up towards the north.
So tonight we are going to effectively go back to, let's say, 1893 it first got to Groudle, so we're doing the 1893 version to Groudle, and then of course 3 years later our railway came into being within the Glen.
That's right. So this tramway, which we'll be going for a ride on later, was originally envisaged much like similar schemes in the UK. It was designed or intended to open up development at the northern end of Douglas here and the lower part of Onchan. And there's a saying that comes with these things: build it and they will come. And that was exactly the intention. We were going to build a railway north towards Laxey, and the idea was the development and the housing would follow suit. That was the original plan behind the creation of the tramway. Now, it didn't quite work out like that, as we will see, and very quickly the tramway became an attraction for visitors in its own right. And actually there are some excellent old photographs that show horse trams bringing in Victorian visitors from the guest houses down on the other end of Douglas Promenade up here to buy their tickets to travel on the new electric railway, and then catching those same horse trams back down the promenade to join the back of the queue for the new electric trams. So it became an attraction in its own right, and of course it didn't really go anywhere, because we tend to take for granted today the development that's all around us. We see this as being part of Douglas and Onchan, and it's all merged into one. But of course back in the 1800s, Douglas was a much smaller town, and it was mainly towards the south round the harbour and round the river area. So there wasn't really much development up here at all. So this railway, whilst it was a nice ride out into the countryside, didn't really go anywhere. And of course the Victorians, being Victorians and being very entrepreneurial, realised that where there was a tramway and where there were people, there was also an opportunity for business. And so all the way along the route here, between here and Groudle, and then eventually north to Laxey and Ramsey, we started to see various businesses and various attractions being established and set up to cater for those Victorian visitors. And Groudle, as we will see later on, was one of those, and the main attraction at the destination of this new tramway.
Nice flowers there, Jonathan.
Lovely, Alex. So I suppose we should say a big thank you to our friends at Alaman Railways tonight, because as you can see, we've got one of the original tram cars for our journey to Groudle. This is car 2, built in 1893 by GF Milnes & Co, who are the same company that produced much of the rolling stock for Groudle. They also built our 4-wheel coaches, which you will have the opportunity to travel on over the summer months, and particularly over the Transport Festival that's coming up. But these cars were experimental in their day, and if you look at the way they're constructed, they are very similar to the older horse trams and horse buses that were much more common around the turn of the 19th century. The design has basically been lengthened, and underneath we have power bogies and electric motors. So these were very much cutting edge for their day. 3 of these cars were delivered for the opening of the tramway in September of 1893. 2 of them survive right the way through to the present day, and they're the oldest operational tram cars in the world. Car 3 sadly was lost in the 1930s Laxey Depot fire, which is the only major loss of rolling stock that the tramway has ever had. So we're going to journey to Groudle tonight on board one of the original cars, just like our predecessors would have done back in the 1890s.
So aboard MER Car 2, Jonathan, almost as it would have been, where are we now, 129 years ago? My maths is terrible.
Absolutely, 129 years ago I think, and we're just passing or coming up on our left hand side to the car sheds and workshops. And what you tend to forget in this day and age is that when the tramway was constructed, there was no public electricity supply on the Isle of Man. In fact, the rest of Douglas and the rest of the island would have to wait nearly 30 years for Douglas Corporation to start generating power at their North Quay power station in 1929. So the tramway company had to generate all of its own electricity, and they built a power station alongside the car sheds and workshops here at Derby Castle on a creek that was dammed. The creek's name was Portavada. It was a popular bathing creek at the time, we believe, and there was actually some local opposition towards filling it in and building the tram sheds and the car and the workshops on that site. Now there was a lot of construction required to build this first half mile or so away from Douglas Promenade and up onto Onken Head, and this is Port Jack. There's a large retaining wall alongside the railway here which is supporting the roadway, the tramway, and actually fills in Port Jack Glen. So it's very difficult to imagine what it would have been like pre-road and pre-tramway, but actually that glen came all the way down as a narrow valley down to the sea, was dammed, blocked off, infilled, and allowed for the creation of the roadway and also the tramway to cross over. Now coming up on our right, as we climb up here away from Port Jack, we will shortly reach the site of another early tourist attraction on the island. That's White City. Now, White City was a very popular destination for the Victorian visitor, and it actually survived right the way through until the late 1980s. White City was an amusement area. There was a wooden roller coaster, dodgems, a ghost train, and various other attractions. It would have been a hive of activity on a summer's evening just like this, with visitors catching the tram from Douglas, spending an evening at White City, and then maybe going back down into Douglas to continue dancing the night away at the Derby Castle ballroom. So again, another example of Victorian entrepreneurism, developing attractions for visitors alongside the route of the tramway.
Now we're going through what nowadays is a modern housing estate, effectively. You mentioned earlier on, of course, that this wasn't necessarily a railway enterprise, it was more a real estate enterprise, wasn't it?
It was. So on the left-hand side of the railway here we have the outskirts of the Housedrake estate. And the idea behind building the tramway, as we said a little earlier, was that it would open up this land on the northern side of Douglas and the lower part of Onken for housing development. That was the intention. The idea was the railway would make it easier for people to be able to travel into Douglas, work, etc. Exactly the same as similar schemes elsewhere in the UK. It's slightly odd because that didn't really happen to its full extent, and although we do have ribbon development here alongside the railway, it's not quite, I don't think, as the original planners intended.
So looking over your shoulder, Jonathan, the one thing you do notice for these original tram cars from 1893, the first 3, not much protection for the driver.
Not at all. So based on the early horse trams of the day, as we say, the drivers were totally exposed. And obviously as the line pushed north towards Laxey and then ultimately to Ramsey, they quite quickly realised that some protection for the crew was desperately needed. And we see the second batch of cars that arrived in 1894 have got enclosed driving positions, although they're largely of the same design. Now you can hear in the background the tram is still climbing here, and we're still making our way up towards the summit of the railway. This first section from Douglas through to Groudle is a little bit like this in terms of it climbs steeply up to a summit at Housedrake and then drops away down to the station at Groudle itself. Now, one of the early challenges that the engineers faced was the tramway system works on 550 volts DC electrical generation. And DC current, whilst it's great for traction motors, is not easy to transport over a long distance. So as well as feeders, we also had a battery house at Groudle, which was an early way to actually store power whilst the trams were coasting or whilst the line wasn't as busy, and then release that power when the trams tried to start simultaneously. And I believe the early timetable was actually constructed in such a way that the trams were not going to simultaneously start from both of the terminus stations, and this was because of the lack of electrical power generated at the time. It's also true to say that the tramway company exported power to the Derby Castle Ballroom and some of the properties at the lower end of Onken. And again, with that being DC power back in the day, it's said that the lights in the ballroom used to dim as the trams pulled away from some of their stops, particularly in the summer months with a heavy load.
We've now come round the headland, and in view, of course, is our little railway.
Absolutely. So we can see off the right-hand side of car 2 here, we're just opening up Groudle Bay and, of course, Groudle Glen Railway. And what you can see here is the sort of land ownership arrangement there would have been back in the Victorian time. We're on the southern side of the Groudle Valley. This land was owned by the Housedrake estate. The northern side that we can see over there was owned by the Broadbent family, who had a property up at Bebelo Beg Farm. So it was Richard Maltby Broadbent who developed the glen as an attraction for the Victorian visitor and built the railway and opened the railway for visitors. He took a lease on the southern side of the valley from the Housedrake Estate Company, and that allowed him to develop the glen and ultimately the railway into an attraction for visitors.
Now, we have mentioned, we've passed it now, but about businesses that were opening up along the line. There used to be, just below the tramway in the road, the remains of the Housedrake Holiday Camp, which...
Yeah, we've slightly missed it in our guided tour. It came on us a bit too fast, but at the summit of this section of the electric railway is the old Housedrake, the site of the old Housedrake Holiday Camp. And that originally was a tented village, and some of the historical pictures that you will see in the guidebook that we have for our railway at Groudle show pictures of the Housedrake Holiday Camp as a tented village. It did get some covered accommodation later on, but again it was a popular destination for the early visitors to the island. There is in fact a tunnel which goes underneath the tramway and underneath the road, allows people to get off the trams and make their way into the holiday village. So we're now approaching the original terminus of the Manx Electric Railway, or the Douglas and Laxey Coast Electric Tramway as it was known then, at Groudle.
So here we are, Jonathan, at the destination.
We've arrived, the original terminus of the Manx Electric Railway here at Groudle. So if you are coming to visit the railway at Groudle over the summer months, you can travel just like we've done on board the Victorian Electric Railway, just like we would have done back in the Victorian era, and enjoy a ride on the tram in glorious summer sunshine to come here to Groudle, and a short walk through the glen to see us down on the railway.
Now, the building behind you, which is in a bit of a sorry state, but it has got it is of great historical importance.
It is, Alex, and it would be lovely, wouldn't it, to be able to pop in for a bite to eat and maybe a pint tonight, but it's not possible. This is the former Groudle Hotel, and it was built by the same Victorian entrepreneur that developed the glen and the railway at Groudle, Richard Maltby Broadbent. In fact, it was the first thing he did. So the Manx people, as always, getting their priorities right. So as soon as the railway tramway arrived here at Groudle, the pub was constructed, and it opened, I think, a few days before the actual railway itself. But it was a public house at the time. And sadly, in more recent times, it's fallen into disrepair. We would dearly love it to be restored and return to its former glory, but at the moment that's not looking too promising.
In terms of the original terminus of the Manx Electric Railway, people will see possibly on a photo on this video that the track has been realigned when it went on to Laxey, because at the original terminus, the cars stopped pretty much right at the front of the building.
And the reason we're demonstrating now, which is because obviously as the road became more popular for modern day motor traffic, it was necessary to move the tramway across to the left-hand side here, and that of course, if we turn round, that of course gave the railway the right swing across the Groudle viaduct to continue its journey up towards the halfway house and then off towards Laxey.
So we've travelled all this way for an evening trip on the railway. I suppose we'd better go and have a little wander through the glen.
We'd better have a wander through the glen, talk about a few points of interest as we go through, and then see if we can find a steam train, Alex.
So Jonathan, we've made our way down the zigzag path to the streams through the glen.
We have, and I suppose the first thing we should say is that this is not actually a natural glen. It was entirely planted and developed by the Victorians. It was originally advertised as the Fern Glen of Mona, and everything you see today dates from the 1800s. Now behind us is the fantastic Groudle Viaduct. Now this of course carries the electric railway and the road across the Groudle Valley, and it was constructed by a local contractor, Thomas Careen, who was also responsible for building several other viaducts and bridges on the electric railway. The arches, I believe, stand 120 feet above the bed of the river and are 20 feet wide, and it was constructed entirely over the winter of 1893 and into 1894.
I think it's safe to say that when you travel over the top of it, you don't realise the magnificent structure below.
Not at all. So it's always well worth coming down here to marvel at the magnificent Victorian engineering that is the Groudle Viaduct.
So where do we go now?
So now we head this way.
So Jonathan, these are just the kind of walks through the glen that the Victorians loved, wasn't it?
They are, and all of these paths were built as the glen was developed. The stream was even improved, so you'll see in one or two spots, if you walk down here, you'll see that there are little weirs that have been put in, and that was to just improve the glen and make it more attractive for the Victorian visitor. But they loved these sorts of walks. There was all sorts of paths like this developed all over the place. Many have disappeared. There were some up on the other side here which you can't necessarily see, that are lost in the undergrowth, but some of them obviously still survive to this day.
However, there is one quite big attraction that's managed to survive just around the corner.
There is, and we'll come to that in a moment. So this is the Little Isabella, and it's a very well-known attraction within the glen here at Groudle. This is actually the third water wheel and water wheel house to stand on this site. The original purpose of the wheel was to pump water from the river up to the Groudle Hotel, which we saw earlier. And there are cast iron storage tanks still in the roof of the hotel, which were used to receive water from the mill here. And we believe the original water wheel actually came from a mill much further up the stream and was potentially rolled down the stream to this location. So that was the original purpose of this wheelhouse. And then in the 1950s, it was renovated again. This time a dynamo was installed, and it was used to drive electric lighting, fairy lights, throughout the glen. Apparently that wasn't particularly successful. I don't think there was any way to actually regulate the speed of the wheel, and the lights would either be very dim or it would burn out all the bulbs, so that didn't really survive. But this wheelhouse that you see today was fully restored a few years ago now, back to its former glory, and once again takes centre place here within the glen at Groudle.
So through the trees, Jonathan, we come across this rather quaint little bandstand.
We do. This particular bandstand dates from the 1990s, but it is on the site of a much larger bandstand and dance floor that was part of the attractions here within Groudle Glen, there was also somewhere in this vicinity a fortune teller who would tell your story, and I believe one of the more common versions of that event was that many a man would meet his doom within the glen here at Groudle.
And anything to do with maybe the courting of lady friends that was referring to?
It might possibly be something to do with that, but who knows, that's lost to the mists of time.
So for visitors who've arrived on the shuttle, they've gone down the path, they've seen the viaduct, they've seen the water wheel, they've seen the bandstand. What's next on the tour? What's
next is the highlight of this whole experience, our very own little railway, just round the corner from here.
So Jonathan, nearly at the highlight of the tour.
Nearly. Just one more thing to show you before we actually head up to the railway. We're now at the bottom of the Len Cohen Valley. So this is where the Len Cohen stream joins the Groudle River, and behind you here is the Len Cohen Canyon. Now, one of the things that was available to the Victorian visitor, which is not available today, was actually possible to walk up the Len Cohen Valley. They put in a bordered walkway that was above the river, so you could explore that natural canyon on your way to visit the railway, which is where we're going now.
So the end of your brisk walk, Jonathan?
End of my brisk walk, and it definitely is that indeed. So we're just about to arrive at Len Cohen Station, and I believe not only have we travelled on one of the original electric railway cars tonight, but I believe we're also going to get the opportunity to travel behind Groudle Glen's original locomotive, Sea Lion.
So here we go, Jonathan, at the end of the journey, almost, as it were.
Almost at the end of the journey, Len Cohen Station. We're just about to begin our ride up the line, out onto the headland and out to Sea Lion.
And let's be honest, the highlight of the journey.
Absolutely the highlight of the journey. And of course, the railway here is fully restored, fully preserved, and is a shining example of what can be achieved really when a group of volunteers set their minds to bringing something back to life.
So, Jonathan, we talked about how the Manx Electric Railway came here in 1893. Of course, this railway wasn't up and running in 1893.
It wasn't. This line itself was built in 1896. Now we think, although it'd be very interesting to see whether we can ever prove this, but we think that there may have been some assistance given by the engineers who were responsible for building the electric railway in the construction of this line here at Groudle. And the reason we think this is when the railway's officers were being cleared out at Strathallan Crescent, where the horse tram depot is now, it actually came across an old map, which was an original survey of the line here at Groudle, which somehow over time had found its way into the archives of Isle of Man Railways. So that does potentially suggest that there may have been some assistance given over maybe the winter of 1895 into 1896 by at least some of the engineers, maybe even some of the construction workers who were responsible for building the electric railway. Would certainly make sense.
Now we're heading off to the terminus at Sea Lion Rocks.
Where just crossing the old packhorse route from Douglas to Laxey. We of course travelled on the electric railway earlier, which parallels the new road which was constructed at the same time as the electric railway. But before that road was constructed, if you wanted to move up the coast from Douglas and up to Laxey in the north, you would have actually followed this packhorse route here, which comes down the side of the Groudle Valley, crossed over the Groudle River at a ford at the beach, and then went up the side of the valley on this side, and then ultimately wound its way north towards Laxey.
Now the terminus at the end here, Sea Lion Rocks, with its zoo. Of course, the zoo was open prior to the railway.
It was. So the zoo opened, I think, a year or so before the actual railway itself. And the railway was built to link the attractions within the Glen, the fortune tellers, the dance floors, photographers, and just the general ambience of the Glen, with the attractions out on the headland. So the zoo was built as a miniature railway, really. It was advertised as the smallest passenger railway in the world. And its purpose was to carry the visitor, save the walk, and carry the visitor from the Glen 3/4 of a mile out onto the headland.
A little view once again there of the House Drake holiday camp across the valley there, and this section of the line sits on a shelf above the sea, doesn't it?
It does, and we think that this shelf actually predates the railway. In the late 1860s, or 1830s, 1860s, there were a series of quite serious cholera outbreaks on the island, and that prompted the authorities at the time to think about establishing a proper public water supply. And one of those early schemes involved a reservoir just north of our station here at Sea Lion Rocks, where there was a stream down, and there's a pipe which we will see shortly, which runs underneath the railway here, going down into a pumping station, it's now the Groudle Beach car park, and then up to a reservoir under the House Drake golf course from where it flowed down into Douglas. So we think that that shelf that was probably cut to accommodate that pipe was then later repurposed, probably widened, and allowed for easier construction of this outer section of the railway.
In fact, if people want to find out more about the Groudle soup pipe, as we call it, tune in to the next video about the zoo.
Yeah, absolutely, we will do a little tour of the Groudle Zoo. So here we are, we've arrived at Sea Lion Rocks on a glorious summer evening, and don't forget you can visit the railway here at Groudle right the way through the summer months. We're open now through until the end of October, running regularly every Sunday, every Wednesday night here now until the end of August. Full details of our services, our fares and our special events are available on our website, ggr.org.uk.
Time for a cup of tea and a piece of cake?
Time for a cup of tea and a piece of cake, sounds like an excellent idea.